The child is born with an enormous task, creating themselves into a fully functioning human being that is perfectly adapted to their time and to their culture. And when we think about it, for an infant to start this process and for a child to continue on, it seems like an almost insurmountable task. But the child is not left without helps in this process. In that first plane of development, the ages from birth to 6, the child is in possession of that absorbent mind, the mind that is just effortlessly taking in information. And this information is used in this process of self-construction. Also in the first plane of development, a child is in possession of what we call sensitive periods. These sensitive periods are working in tandem with the absorbent mind, driving energy and focus for the child in this process of becoming a fully developed human being. A sensitive period is a point in time in which a child is motivated to acquire a specific characteristic or skill. The sensitive periods were not a discovery of Dr. Montessori. However, she was the first person to identify them in the development of children. Sensitive periods had already been identified in plants and in animals. Hugo de Vries was the scientist, the botanist, that termed the phrase sensitive periods. What he observed was in the development and growth of the poppy, there was a point in time where this plant was extremely susceptible and vulnerable to the external environmental conditions. This is what he deemed a sensitive period. Jacques Loeb was a physiologist who was experimenting with a variety of animals. And it was with the larva of the Portesia butterfly that he was able to observe sensitive periods. The larvae hatched and remained in their nests through the cold winter months. Now, when spring came and the weather warmed, the sun shined more brightly and powerfully. The larvae were drawn out of the nest and they moved to the very ends of the tree branches. And it was at the very ends of the tree branches was the only food that was suitable for them. And those were the fresh new leaf shoots. And they would stay there on the end of the branches until they had grown sufficiently that this was no longer the best food for them. And it was then that they left the ends of those branches for more dense leaves. This was now the better food for them. They never returned to the end of the tree branches to eat those fresh leaves again. Jacques Loeb believed this to be a sensitive period. Dr. Montessori, being a scientist herself, saw the value in the work of these two men, and she began to apply it to what she was observing with children. Sensitive periods are now widely recognized as being a fundamental piece of child development. They're not always called sensitive periods. Sometimes they're called critical periods or windows of learning, but they are all meaning the very same thing. These periods are not within the will of the child to control. They are a psychological phenomenon that appears spontaneously. They do appear within very predictable time frames, though, for every child, regardless of where the child lives, what race they are, and what gender they are. The difference is the environment in which the child exists. Either it's going to help support a full satisfaction of the sensitive period, or it's going to get in the way, impeding natural development. When this happens, a sensitive period's work is left undone. It doesn't mean that learning can't happen later, but without this sensitive period fully active, the learning will be more laborious. Sensitive periods are also transitory, which means they don't last forever. Once a sensitive period closes, it closes forever. Each sensitive period has a developmental goal. Dr. Montessori identified some broad sensitive periods. The sensitive period for language, for movement, for order, and for the refinement of sensory perceptions. When I talked earlier that a sensitive period is transitory, this is all the more reason for the trained adult to be able to recognize what a sensitive period looks like as a child is passing through it. When we can identify a sensitive period as it's being manifested, we can offer supports to the child to fully maximize the goal of that sensitive period. The child in the first plane of development, from the age of birth to 6, has 2 very powerful gifts: the gift of the absorbent mind and the gift of the sensitive periods that are working together, supporting their development. Next, we're going to talk more specifically about each of the sensitive periods and how they serve the child.